There's a quiet violence we do to ourselves not with fists or words, but with the slow suffocation of who we truly are. A kind of inner betrayal we carry out in the name of acceptance, obedience, decency. Shame is the blade, but we wield it ourselves. From the moment we learn to speak, we also learn what not to say. We learn what not to feel, who not to be. We become experts at silence not outwardly, but inwardly. Repressing our rage, denying our desires, flattening our quirks to fit the mold. But in doing so, we create a shadow life beneath the surface. And slowly, shame becomes a religion. A quiet, tyrannical God we serve without question. Nietzsche saw this clearly. His philosophy wasn't a cold academic exercise, it was a cry from the soul, forged in loneliness, illness, and the searing clarity of solitude. He watched the moral scaffolding of Western civilization rot from within, and dared to ask, what if the very virtues we cherish are symptoms of our sickness? What if shame is not proof of goodness, but a noose hung by society around the neck of the vital individual? To become who you are, that was Nietzsche's call. But this isn't a motivational slogan. It's an existential confrontation. A lifelong war against the parts of ourselves we were told to abandon. Against the voice that whispers, you're too much. You're not enough. You're unworthy. In this video, we're going to peel back the layers of shame, repression, and moral conditioning to explore what it truly means to overcome shame and become the self you were meant to be. We'll journey through Nietzsche's fire, walk alongside Carl Jung into the unconscious, and stare into the psychological abyss with Freud and Dostoevsky. This is not self-help. This is self-confrontation. And you may not leave the same. To understand shame, we must first sit with it, not run, not justify, but simply observe the shape it takes within us. Shame is not guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. It's not merely an emotion. It is a verdict internalized, unconscious, and corrosive. It festers in silence, growing stronger the longer it remains unexamined. In psychological terms, shame arises when our internal sense of self fails to meet the expectations of others, real or imagined. A child ridiculed for crying learns to hide softness. A teenager mocked for dreaming too big learns to lower their gaze. These small humiliations carve deep grooves in the psyche. Over time, we begin to fear visibility itself. Not just because we might be judged, but because we already judge ourselves more harshly than anyone else ever could. Carl Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And shame is the reason why. To face the soul means confronting the raw, unedited version of ourselves, the one with contradictions, with desires we've exiled, with rage, envy, pride, and yearning. But shame tells us these parts are unworthy of love. So we suppress them, bury them, lock them away in what Jung called the shadow. And yet, ironically, the more we repress, the more fractured we become. We begin to act not from freedom, but from compensation. The overly humble man might secretly crave dominance. The selfless caretaker may quietly resent those they serve. The stoic achiever may be terrified of being seen as vulnerable or weak. Shame twists the psyche, forging masks we forget are masks. Nietzsche was no stranger to this inner contortion. In his critique of morality, especially Christian morality, he argued that what society often labels as good is merely the sublimation of powerlessness. He called it slave morality, a value system born from resentment, where the weak vilify the strong not out of principle, but out of envy and impotence. The noble soul has reverence for itself. Nietzsche beyond good and evil. But how can one revere oneself when shame has already declared us defective? This is the psychological trap. We learn to see ourselves not through our own eyes, but through the eyes of those who shamed us. Parents, teachers, religious figures, culture, they become internal voices, speaking long after they've disappeared. Jung called this the collective persona, the socially acceptable mask we wear. But behind it, something primal burns. A self that refuses to die. Consider the figure of Ivan Karamazov in Dostoevsky's The Brothers, Karamazov, a man torn between intellectual brilliance and moral despair. Ivan cannot reconcile the suffering of the world with the existence of a just God, and this dissonance tears him apart. Beneath his guilt, we sense a deeper shame, not just about the world, but about his own helplessness to make sense of it. He is brilliant but impotent, morally conscious but emotionally paralyzed. The shame is existential. And this existential shame, the sense that we are inadequate not just personally, but cosmically, is what Nietzsche sought to burn away. His solution was not comfort but confrontation. He didn't want you to feel better about yourself. He wanted you to annihilate the false self, the inherited values, the shame-conditioned identity, and create yourself anew. This is where philosophy meets psychology. The courage to confront shame becomes the catalyst for rebirth. But first, we must trace where it comes from, not just in our own lives, but in the larger story of our civilization. To overcome shame, we must understand how deeply it's woven into the very fabric of our civilization. Shame is not just personal, it is historical. It is ancestral. It has been used as a tool of social control, of religious purification, of moral conditioning across cultures, across centuries. Let's begin with the oldest narrative many in the West are taught, the story of Adam and Eve. Before eating the forbidden fruit, they are naked and unashamed. But after disobedience, their first act is to hide, to cover themselves. And God asks the most haunting question in the history of myth: who told you that you were naked? That's shame. The birth of self-consciousness, not just as awareness, but as fear of being seen. This myth contains something psychologically universal. The moment we become aware of our individuality, we also become aware of its potential rejection. In that moment, we split. There is the self we are, and the self we must present. And the history of civilization is, in many ways, the management of this split. Ancient societies developed elaborate codes of shame and honor. In Rome, dignita's personal worth was publicly earned, publicly judged. In Japan, haji, shame, and giri, duty, governed behavior more stringently than laws. In tribal cultures, exile, the shame of separation, was often worse than death. In each case, shame kept the social fabric intact. It wasn't just punishment. It was identity. You were who society allowed you to be. But what happens when society itself is built on neurosis? Nietzsche believed that the Christian moral revolution turned the noble, instinctive human spirit into something tame, obedient, and guilt-ridden. Where ancient cultures saw pride, power, and passion as natural forces, Christianity labeled them sinful. The vital energies of life, sex, ambition, rage, self-love were redirected inward, pathologized. Man suffers so deeply that he had to invent laughter. Nietzsche. And so, European man, once a creature of conquest, and instinct became a creature of shame and self-repression. Guilt became virtue. All the life-affirming instincts were inverted. Good became evil. Evil became good. Even Freud, from a different angle, noticed the same trend. In Civilization and its Discontents, he argued that the progress of civilization demanded the repression of instinct. But this repression didn't eliminate desire, it buried it. And from beneath the surface, it warped the psyche. In modern times, we are told we're free, yet most of us live in constant fear of deviation. The shame is more subtle now. It comes in the form of idealized beauty, social media perfection, moral outrage, corporate etiquette. You are still judged, still shamed. Only now the tribunal is invisible and omnipresent. Carl Jung believed that this cultural inheritance is stored in the collective unconscious. We carry the shame of our ancestors. The moral codes of long-dead priests still shape our impulses. And the only way forward is to face this, to individuate, to become whole. But first, we must understand how shame has embedded itself inside us, not as a relic of history, but as a voice in our heads. And the most dangerous part? We believe it's our own. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the very heart of shadow work, the process of facing what we've hidden, denied, or disowned within ourselves. Shame isn't just an emotion. It's the architect of the unconscious. Every time we flinch from our own truth, we bury it deep, beneath the layers of civility and conditioning. But buried is not gone. What we repress becomes the shadow, a constellation of everything we refuse to see in ourselves. And the more we deny it, the more it governs us. This is why your anger explodes at the wrong people, why you sabotage relationships that feel too close, why your dreams are haunted by symbols you don't understand. The unconscious is not a storage closet. It is alive. And shame is its gatekeeper. Imagine a man raised to believe that showing emotion is weakness. He grows up stoic, composed, perhaps even admired for his restraint. But beneath that polished exterior, his shadow grows loud, full of repressed grief, unspoken tenderness, unmet needs. One day, a trivial loss shatters him. Or he falls in love, and instead of joy, he feels terror. Why? Because love demands vulnerability, the very thing shame taught him to fear. This is the paradox. The parts of ourselves we bury don't disappear, they become symptoms. The unlived life doesn't go away. It haunts us. As Jung put it, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Nietzsche understood this well, though he spoke in mythic tones. He gave us the concept of the Übermensch, the Overman, not as a superhero, but as a human being who has overcome the moral and psychological limitations imposed by herd values. He is one who has integrated his shadow, not by purging it, but by owning it. You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. Nietzsche, thus spoke Zarathustra. To become who you are, you must first meet who you've hidden. And this meeting is not gentle. Shadow work is brutal. It is the process of peeling away illusions, of realizing that much of what you thought was you was actually a mask, a defense, a strategy for survival. You were not born ashamed. You were taught shame. And now you must unlearn it. In the myth of the hero's journey, there's always a descent into the underworld, into Hades, the belly of a whale, the dark forest. This is not symbolic fluff. It's a psychological map. The underworld is the unconscious. The monsters are our shadows. And the treasure we seek, authenticity, selfhood, wholeness, lies guarded by the very dragons we fear to face. But here's the rub. Most people never descend. We distract, deflect, project. We stay on the surface, polishing the ego, while our unlived life seethes below. Jung observed that the modern person is often possessed by the very qualities they deny in themselves. The preacher who falls from grace. The activist who hides deep intolerance. The saint who resents their own goodness. The more we disown a part of ourselves, the more violently it erupts elsewhere in addictions, neuroses, failed relationships, or even political ideologies. Dostoevsky captured this brilliantly in Notes from Underground, a psychological portrait of a man so consumed by his own contradictions and resentment that he can no longer act. He is intelligent, self-aware, articulate, and utterly paralyzed. He lives in his shame like a coffin. He mocks others while secretly envying them. He knows himself, but does not forgive himself. This is what happens when shadow work is begun, but never completed. To face the shadow is to risk madness. But to avoid it is to guarantee it. The internal conflict between the persona we show and the shadow we hide tears us apart. But within that tension lies the potential for transformation. Nietzsche wrote, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." But he also added, "And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you." The abyss is your own unconscious, your own shame. And if you're willing to look into it, not with fear, but with curiosity, you may find not a monster, but a map. We live in a world that offers 1,000 ways to escape ourselves, and we take them eagerly. Scroll, swipe, click, watch, repeat. Never before in human history has the external world offered so much stimulation, so much distraction. And yet, never before have we been so alienated from our inner lives. The paradox is blinding, a society saturated with information, but starved of insight. Constant communication, but no real connection. We are drowning in the shallow, while starving in the deep. And that too is shame. Not the old kind of religious, overt condemnation of sin, but a modern, invisible shame. The chronic sense that we are not enough and never will be. That unless we're constantly improving, performing, broadcasting our happiness, our productivity, our virtue, we are failing. It's no wonder we numb ourselves. Social media, consumerism, binge culture, these are not random phenomena. They are anesthetics. Modern life is engineered to protect us from silence. And silence is dangerous because it holds a mirror. It reminds us of the parts of ourselves we've abandoned, the dreams we've deferred, the truths we've buried. In silence, the shadow speaks. But we run. In psychological terms, we dissociate. We fragment. We become so accustomed to curating our image that we forget we're performing. The self becomes an algorithm fine-tuned for likes, for approval, for safety. We develop what psychologist Donald Winnicott called the false self, a persona designed to meet external expectations while keeping the true self hidden. Safe. Unseen. Freud saw this coming. In Civilization and its Discontents, he warned that the suppression of instinct in favor of social order would create neurotic, restless individuals constantly oscillating between craving and guilt. The 21st century proves him right. Our technologies have outpaced our souls. Our comforts have made us emotionally frail. And our distractions, so colorful, so constant, keep us from asking the most terrifying question: what do I actually want? Because wanting something deeply, authentically, requires vulnerability. It requires risk. And risk threatens the carefully crafted image we've built. So we avoid. Not just by watching Netflix or scrolling TikTok, but by weaponizing productivity, even spiritualism. The rise of self-help culture is, in many cases, a sophisticated evasion. We optimize instead of introspect. We become obsessed with routines, goals, morning habits, not as a path toward authenticity, but as a buffer from shame. Carl Jung would say we are mistaking the ego's survival for the soul's evolution. And the soul cannot evolve if we are constantly sedated. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Carl Jung. And so we live not in reality, but in simulation. Not in presence, but in projection. We wear busyness like armor. We call fear practicality. We label numbness normal. But beneath the noise, the soul waits. It waits for the moment we are brave enough to stop running, to turn off the screen, to let the silence in, to feel the ache we've tried so hard to mute. Because in that ache is truth. And in that truth is transformation. But that path isn't paved with dopamine hits or curated images. It begins in discomfort, in honesty, in surrender, in the decision to finally face the life we've been avoiding. Transformation does not begin in comfort, it begins in collapse. In the moment the mask falls away, the roles dissolve, and what remains is the naked self, confused, aching, uncertain. That is where real change begins. Not when we pretend to be better, but when we admit that we are not whole. The journey to becoming who you are is not a climb up, it is a descent, a breaking, a surrender. Carl Jung called this individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the unconscious into consciousness, the shadow into light, the fragmented self into unity. It is not self-improvement, it is self-encounter. And it is terrifying, because it demands that we give up the identities we were praised for: the good child, the high achiever, the selfless caretaker, in order to reclaim the parts of us we were taught to reject. But this, Jung insisted, is how we become real. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Carl Jung. And yet, what does that mean practically? What does it look like to become whole? It begins with honesty. Brutal, compassionate honesty. To say, this is my envy. This is my rage. This is my longing. This is my fear. You do not justify it. You do not excuse it. You hold it like a wounded child and say, you are part of me. Because the shadow does not disappear. When confronted, it integrates. From there, meaning is not something we discover, but something we create. Nietzsche rejected the idea of objective meaning handed down from on high. After the death of God, meaning must be forged by the individual, through action, through suffering, through courage. His concept of amor fati, the love of one's fate, asks us to affirm life, not despite its pain, but because of it. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Nietzsche. To embrace your life as it is, the shame, the mistakes, the longing, the madness, is to reclaim authorship of your story. It is to stop living as a character in someone else's narrative and begin writing your own. This is not abstraction. People do this every day. The former addict who finally sees his addiction not as a flaw, but as a symbol of hunger, of buried pain, of ancestral trauma. He does not just get clean. He transforms. He turns his suffering into service, into art, into truth. The woman who, after years of silence, dares to speak her story. Not to blame, not to boast, but to be seen. And in being seen, she reclaims the parts of herself shame tried to erase. The man who once feared his ambition, his sexuality, his rage, who integrates those energies not as threats, but as forces of vitality. He does not become good. He becomes whole. This is what Jung meant by living symbolically. Not living according to dogma, but with depth, seeing your dreams, your conflicts, your desires as symbols, as messages from the unconscious. Your life becomes a myth, not a fiction, but a narrative rich with meaning. But meaning is not always bliss. Often it is born in fire. Dostoevsky's characters knew this. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan represents the rational intellect, brilliant but cold, full of arguments but empty of meaning. Alyosha, his spiritual counterpart, is not without suffering, but his suffering opens him. His pain becomes compassion. His faith is not dogma, it is transformation through love. To live meaningfully is not to live without pain, it is to suffer consciously. to feel your life fully, to no longer run from your depths, but to walk into them, lantern in hand. The goal is not to be pure. The goal is to be real. And realness begins where shame ends, not in perfection, but in presence. When you look at your past and say, yes, this too is me. When you look at your future and say, I will walk toward it, even afraid. When you wake each morning, not to fulfill someone else's script, but to author your own. That is transformation. And that is freedom. It begins as a whisper, a quiet discomfort, a subtle dissonance, a faint but persistent sense that the life you are living is not entirely your own. This is the soul's way of knocking. At first, we ignore it. We bury it beneath productivity, beneath our roles, our responsibilities, our endless scroll. But the soul is patient. And over time, the whisper grows louder. It becomes dissatisfaction, restlessness, anxiety, depression. These are not mere pathologies, are messages. The psyche does not scream unless we have ignored the whisper. Nietzsche once asked, what does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are. It's an impossible command, and yet the only one worth obeying. To become who you are is not to invent yourself from scratch. It is to remember, to return, to reassemble the pieces of your fractured self and say, I will no longer live divided. It is the slow, difficult rebirth of a human being who has chosen truth over comfort, integrity over applause, meaning over distraction. It will not make you rich. It will not make you popular, but will make you real. The shame that once chained you will become a teacher. The shadow that once haunted you will become a guide. And the parts of you once buried will rise, not as threats, but as gifts. I beg you to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart and to try to love the questions themselves. Rainer Maria Rilke. This is the inner call. Not a dramatic moment, but a quiet decision to stop fleeing and start listening. To stop pretending and start living. It doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with silence, with solitude, with a mirror you don't look away from. The world will try to make you forget, but your soul will keep remembering. So stop, breathe, listen. Beneath the shame, beneath the noise, beneath the masks, there is a voice, and it is saying, come home. If something stirred within you while listening to this, a memory, a discomfort, a longing, don't ignore it. That's the signal. That's your soul breaking through the static. This isn't just philosophy. It's a doorway. You don't have to overhaul your life overnight, but you do need to begin. Pick up a journal. Write honestly about what you hide, what you fear, what you want but are afraid to want. Not for anyone else. Just for you. Start small, but start real. Turn your attention inward, not to fix yourself, but to know yourself. Ask, what parts of me have I exiled in shame? What desires have I silenced? What anger have I swallowed? And more importantly, who might I become if I no longer needed to hide? Do shadow work. Explore dreams. Sit in silence. Read Jung. Read Nietzsche. Read Dostoevsky, not as literature, but as soul maps. Begin building a symbolic life, one where your experiences have meaning, where your pain has purpose, where your voice has weight. You are not here to live someone else's life. You are here to become fully, fiercely, unapologetically yourself. No one can walk that path for you. But you are not alone. There are others, quiet, inward, awakening, walking beside you in the dark. So answer the call. Not with certainty, not with perfection, but with courage. Because your life, the real one, the one buried beneath the shame, and the performance is still waiting. And it's time to return to it.